They sold the pregnant black girl to the mountain man as a punishment. That's what the whole town of Cutter's Creek came out to see. Snow was already starting to fall, thick wet flakes that promised a hard winter. Coins clinked in gloved hands as men placed their bets. The miners, their faces still smudged with coal dust, laughed the loudest, betting on how many days she'd survive in his frozen cabin high up in the passes. But the man they all feared, the silent giant they called Jonas McBride, he didn't buy her for labor, and he didn't buy her for shame. He bought her for a reason so secret, so tied to the ghosts of that mountain, that no one in that jeering crowd could have ever guessed it. Because up in the high country, where the wind screams like a banshee, trouble was already brewing. A letter had arrived, sealed with wax and dripping with poison. A railroad company was coming, and they were ready to take his land, his water, his home. The only thing that could stop them was a piece of paper, a proof of ownership hidden where no one in town would ever dare to look. They thought the girl was just a broken thing, carrying nothing but a child in a whole lot of disgrace. They were wrong. She carried the will to fight. She carried a secret of her own. And as the winter deepened and the last road out of the valley was buried under 10 feet of snow, the people of Cutter's Creek were about to learn a lesson. They were about to find out what happens when you push two outcasts too far, and they were about to learn what it really means to be saved. The bitter wind howled down the main street of Cutter's Creek. It whipped the snow into stinging little clouds that bit at any piece of exposed skin. I stumbled, my boots slipping in the frozen mud, but Mrs. Evers just yanked me forward by the arm. Her fingers were like talons digging into my flesh, sharp and merciless. My other hand was pressed flat against my swollen belly, trying to shield my baby from the jerking and the cold. "Thief!" Mrs. Evers' voice was high and sharp, cutting through the wind. It carried across the muddy street and bounced off the false fronts of the buildings. "This ungrateful girl stole my mother's gold brooch." My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break right through. "I didn't steal anything, ma'am," I whispered, the words getting lost in the wind. "Please, I swear I didn't." She gave my arm another vicious shake, rattling my teeth. "I took you in. When no one else would give you the time of day, I gave you a roof and a bed. And this is how you repay my Christian charity?" Her shouting was like ringing a dinner bell. People started coming out of the shops, their faces pale in the gray afternoon light. Miners, fresh from their shifts, stopped on the boardwalks. Townswomen, bundled in their shawls, gathered in a rough circle around us. Their faces were a nasty mix of curiosity and cold, hard judgment. I felt their stares like little stones hitting my skin, especially the ones that lingered on my rounded middle. They looked at me like I was something dirty, something that needed to be swept out of their town. "Since she can't pay her debt," Mrs. Evers announced, her voice ringing with a cruel kind of satisfaction, "I'm selling her contract to recover my losses. Who will start the bidding?" A wave of crude laughter rippled through the crowd. I felt sick to my stomach. This couldn't be happening. A few of the miners stepped forward, their eyes gleaming with an ugly light. I'd seen these men at the boarding house. I'd heard their whispered comments when I served them their meals, felt their greasy gazes following me as I cleared their plates. Now there was nothing between me and their foul intentions but Mrs. Evers's greed. $2, one of them called out. He was missing most of his front teeth. "3," another one shouted, elbowing his friend out of the way to get a better look at me. My legs started to tremble so badly I was afraid I'd fall. The bids kept climbing. $5, 6. Each offer was followed by a coarse joke that made my cheeks burn hot with shame. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the ground to open up and swallow me whole. I didn't want to see their faces anymore. Then a voice cut through the ugly chaos. It was deep and steady, and it silenced everyone. $20. The whole crowd went quiet. The miners who had been shoving their way to the front suddenly shuffled backward. The circle parted, and I opened my eyes to see a tall figure standing at the edge of the gathering. It was Jonas McBride. He stood there like a great stone in a fast-moving river. His long, weathered duster was flapping in the wind, and snow had dusted his dark beard in the wide brim of his worn hat. His face was like carved wood, impossible to read, but his eyes were fixed right on me. McBride had a reputation. He was the solitary mountain man who rarely ever came to town. They said he'd been a legendary buffalo hunter before settling in his remote cabin. Some folks whispered that he'd been married to a Cherokee woman and that she had died in some tragic way. Others whispered even darker tales, stories about a man who was more animal than human, who preferred the company of wolves to people. Mrs. Evers's cruel smile faltered. She looked from the mountain man to the coins in her hand, suddenly seeming unsure. "Mr. McBride, surely you don't—" $20, he repeated. His voice was flat, without any emotion at all. Cash. He pulled a heavy leather pouch from inside his coat. The silence stretched on. The crowd just watched, holding their breath. No one dared to outbid him. Even the rowdiest of the miners could sense something dangerous in his quiet certainty. There was a power in his stillness that was more frightening than all their loudmouth bluster. "Very well," Mrs. Evers said finally, her voice tight with disappointment. She'd probably hoped for a bidding war, a bit more sport. "Sold. To Mr. McBride." He walked forward, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't look at anyone else. He just came straight to me. He counted out the heavy coins one by one, dropping them into Mrs. Evers's outstretched hand. The sound they made was like nails being hammered into a coffin. My coffin. Then he did something I never expected. Without a single word, he shrugged off his own heavy buffalo coat, the one that was keeping him warm against the biting wind, and wrapped it around my shoulders. The warmth of it was immediate, shocking. The fur-lined collar was soft against my neck, and it carried a faint, clean scent of pine smoke and leather and cold mountain air. I stood there frozen, my mind racing a mile a minute. I'd heard the stories about his isolated cabin, high up in the timberline where no one ever went. Was this a rescue? Or was it something much, much worse? But when I finally got the courage to look up into his face, I didn't see any cruelty there. I just saw a deep, distant sadness, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of understanding. The snow was falling harder now, thick white flakes that caught in my eyelashes and melted on my hot cheeks. He turned his back on the town and led me over to where his bay horse stood waiting, its breath steaming in the frigid air. The pack mule tied behind it shifted its weight, its eyes rolling nervously at the quiet crowd. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the wind. I hesitated. The horse looked enormous and in my condition, but what choice did I have? Go with the silent mountain man, or stay here and face whatever the miners had in mind? It wasn't a choice at all. "I'll manage," I whispered. He cupped his hands together to make a step for me. I gathered my thin skirts and his heavy coat, placed my worn-out boot in his palms, and he lifted me with a surprising gentleness. He helped me settle sideways on the horse's broad, warm back. The bay stood perfectly still, as if it sensed my fear and uncertainty. The townspeople were already starting to disperse. Their little show was over. Only Mrs. Evers remained, her back to us, counting her coins with a greedy satisfaction. McBride took the horse's reins, and without a single backward glance at the town that had just sold me like a piece of livestock, he led us away. We passed the last crooked buildings of Cutter's Creek in a heavy silence, the only sound the crunch of the horse's hooves in the fresh snow. The woods loomed ahead of us, a wall of dark pines heavy with their white burden. I clutched the buffalo coat tighter around me, fighting back a wave of tears. They were tears of fear, yes, but also tears of relief, and underneath it all, a deep, churning confusion. "Thank you," I managed to say. My voice was barely audible. He didn't respond right away. He just kept walking, his shoulders set and his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. When he finally did speak, his words were careful, measured, as if he was weighing each one. "Nobody," he said, his voice a low rumble, "deserves to be treated that way." And then we were in the timber, leaving the town and its cruel judgments far behind. The snow fell steadily, a thick white curtain that gradually erased our tracks, as if nature itself was trying to wash away the memory of my public shame. Ahead of me lay a complete unknown, a future as blank and white as the landscape. But behind me lay only pain. So we pressed on, deeper into the gathering storm. An unlikely pair, a silent mountain man and a disgraced pregnant girl, bound together by a single act of mercy in a harsh and unforgiving land. What awaited us up there in the high passes, I had no idea. But I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The forest swallowed us whole. One minute we were on the edge of town. The next we were surrounded by a silent army of snow-covered pines. The bay horse's hooves made soft, crunching sounds, a gentle rhythm in the deep quiet. The voice of the wind changed too. It was no longer a howl, but a whisper that moved through the high branches overhead. I found myself studying the man who walked ahead of me. His back was broad, his shoulders powerful beneath his worn shirt. I tried to read something of my fate in the set of his shoulders, in the deliberate, steady pace of his stride. Was he a savior, or just a different kind of monster? I had no illusions about my situation. I was still technically bound by a contract. He owned me. That was the law. But the way he had stepped in, the simple dignity with which he'd covered me against the cold, it didn't feel like a purchase. It felt like a rescue. Still, experience had taught me a hard lesson. It taught me to be wary of any man's kindness, especially when I was this vulnerable. The baby shifted inside me, a gentle, rolling movement. It was a constant, living reminder of trust I had misplaced once before. I wouldn't make that mistake again. I adjusted my position on the horse, trying to find a more comfortable spot, and one hand went to my side. The small movement caught McBride's attention. He glanced back over his shoulder, his expression still unreadable in the gathering dusk. His eyes met mine for just a second, and then he turned away again, his focus returning to the trail. The journey seemed to go on forever. The winter twilight deepened, painting the snow in shades of purple and gray. We were leaving behind the last echoes of the town's cruelty, moving toward whatever fate awaited us in the silent, snow-shrouded forest. The cold was starting to seep into my bones now, a deep, aching chill that his heavy coat couldn't quite keep out. Just when I thought I couldn't bear another moment of the cold and the rocking motion of the horse, Jonas stopped. Through the swirling snow, I could just make out the dark shape of a cabin. It was nestled against the mountainside, tucked into a grove of tall aspens. It looked small and sturdy, and a thin, promising curl of smoke was rising from its stone chimney. The sight of it, the promise of warmth, made my throat feel tight with a confusing mix of relief and apprehension. "We're here," Jonas said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. He came to my side and helped me down from the horse. His hands were careful on my arms, but his touch was impersonal, brief. When my feet touched the ground, my legs almost buckled. They were stiff and numb from the long hours of riding. He didn't seem to notice. He just led the animals to a small lean-to shelter built against the side of the cabin, and he started removing their tack with quick, efficient movements. I stood where he'd left me, in the middle of a small clearing, uncertain what to do. The heavy buffalo coat dragged at my shoulders, weighted down with the snow it had collected. I felt small and lost. The cabin door creaked open, and he gestured for me to go inside. I stepped over the threshold, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. The inside was spare, but it was clean and neat. There was a simple plank table and 2 chairs, a big cast-iron cook stove against one wall, and a narrow bed pushed against the other. A sturdy ladder led up to a sleeping loft. 2 long rifles hung on pegs over the fireplace, their metal gleaming dully in the light from the flames. The heat from the banked fire in the stove reached out and wrapped around me like a blanket. I couldn't help but move closer to it, holding out my numb hands to the warmth. Behind me, Jonas moved with that same quiet efficiency. He hung his hat and coat on a peg, struck a match, and lit a tin lamp on the table. The yellow flame pushed back the gathering darkness, filling the small room with a soft, flickering glow. "Sit," he said, indicating one of the chairs at the table. "I'll build up the fire." I perched on the very edge of the seat, watching him. He knelt by the stove and added several pieces of split pine to the fire. The flames leaped up, crackling and hissing. My eyes kept being drawn to the rifles on the wall. I had traded the known dangers of the town for this isolated cabin, this silent, unknown man, and his guns. My heart started beating a little faster. What had I gotten myself into? He straightened up from the stove and moved to a heavy pot that was sitting at the back, keeping warm. "There's venison stew," he said, not looking at me. "You should eat." The rich smell of the food suddenly hit me, and my stomach clenched with a sharp pang of hunger. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd had a proper meal. Still, I hesitated. I had to know. Why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why did you bring me here? He paused, his hand hovering over the pot. His face was half turned away from me, shadowed in the lamplight. For a long moment, I didn't think he was going to answer. To keep you from harm, he said finally. His voice was low and steady. He turned to face me then, and his eyes were clear and direct. Not to own you. The simple, direct way he said it, it felt true, but I still didn't understand. Why would you care what happens to me? He didn't answer that. Instead, he ladled the thick stew into 2 bowls. He set one in front of me, along with a thick chunk of dark bread. Because, he said, his voice flat, but with a dark current moving just beneath the surface, I've seen what men in that town will do. We ate in silence. The stew was plain, but it was hot and filling. The meat was tender, and the broth was rich with herbs. It was the best thing I had tasted in months. When I was finished, Jonas took my empty bowl without a word and set it aside with his own. He picked up a broken snowshoe that was leaning against the wall near the door and sat down in the other chair. He began working on it, his big, rough hands surprisingly deft as he wove new rawhide lacings. The wind rose outside, whistling through the pines and finding every tiny crack in the cabin's walls. I pulled the buffalo coat closer around me, even though the room was warm enough now. The rifles on the wall still caught my eye, but somehow they seemed less threatening now. There was something about the quiet, focused way he worked, the respectful space he kept between us, that was starting to ease some of my deep-seated fear. You'll take the main room, he said suddenly, his eyes still on his mending. I'll sleep in the loft. I stared at him, surprised. I couldn't take your bed. It's not a request. His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. You need it more than I do. He finished his work on the snowshoe and hung it back on its peg by the door. There are extra blankets in that chest if you get cold. Before I could respond, he turned and climbed the ladder to the loft. The wooden rungs creaked under his weight. I heard him moving around up there for a few moments, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards. And then there was silence. Silence, except for the soft crackle of the fire and the wind's lonely song. I sat there in the chair for a long, long time, just listening. The baby moved inside me again, a gentle, reassuring flutter, a reminder that I wasn't truly alone. Gradually, a wave of exhaustion, so deep it was like a physical weight, washed over me. I moved to the narrow bed. It was firm but clean. I wrapped myself in the heavy buffalo coat and pulled the thick wool blankets he'd mentioned from the chest. Sleep was slow to come. My mind kept turning over the day's events, playing them again and again like a strange and terrible dream. The shame of the auction, the terror of being sold, and now, this unexpected, quiet sanctuary. Trust didn't come easily to me. Not anymore. But there was something about Jonas McBride's gruff, quiet kindness that felt honest. He could have left me to the mercy of those miners. He could have treated me like the property he'd paid for. Instead, he'd given me his coat, his food, his bed, and most importantly, he'd given me his distance. The wind continued its wild song outside, but within the sturdy walls of the cabin, I felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation stealing over me. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was something like the beginning of it. I closed my eyes, one hand resting protectively over my belly, and finally I let sleep take me. High above me in the dark loft, Jonas lay awake too. He stared up at the rough-hewn ceiling, listening to the storm's rage. And he was remembering another night, years ago, another storm, and another person he had failed to protect. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-laden forest in soft shades of pearl and rose. Inside the cabin, a soft crackling sound woke me. I opened my eyes and saw Jonas kneeling by the cook stove, stirring the embers and adding fresh kindling. The fire caught quickly, and a welcome warmth began to spread through the chilly air. He glanced over at the bed where I lay bundled in his coat. He didn't say anything, just gave a slight nod, as if to acknowledge I was awake. The rich, comforting aroma of coffee soon filled the small space. Miss Carter. His voice was low. He was standing by the table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. Made coffee. There's cornbread from yesterday. He set the mug and a piece of cornbread on the table, then stepped back, giving me my space. Thank you, I said softly. I wrapped one of the wool blankets around my shoulders and made my way to the chair. The warmth of the ceramic mug felt wonderful in my cold hands. While I ate, Jonas pulled on his heavy coat and boots. Need to show you something important once you've finished. Outside, the air was so cold it felt sharp in my lungs. Our breath formed white clouds in front of our faces. Jonas led me along a narrow, packed-down path through the deep snow. Cabins here, he said, stating the obvious. Woodpiles there. But the most important thing is the waterhole. He pointed to a spot in the creek where the current ran fast and deep, keeping the water from freezing completely over. Ice gets treacherous. Best to test it with a stick each time before you step too close. I studied the area, committing it to memory. The creek gurgled and chuckled beneath its icy covering. A few brave little birds called to each other from the snow-laden branches overhead. Despite the biting cold, the morning held a pristine, untouched beauty that made my breath catch in my throat. This was a different world from the dirty, crowded streets of Cutter's Creek. Back inside the warm cabin, Jonas built up the fire again. Got things need doing today, he said. Cabin could use some straightening, if you're of a mind to help. Of course, I replied quickly. I was grateful to have something to do, a way to feel useful. It's the least I can do. We fell into a comfortable, easy rhythm of work. He went back outside, and soon I could hear the steady thunk, thunk, thunk of his axe splitting firewood. Inside, I started to bring some order to the cabin. The shelves held a jumble of supplies, sacks of flour, dried herbs, boxes of ammunition, tools, and various other containers. I began to organize them, wiping away the dust and arranging things neatly. A torn quilt draped over the back of a chair caught my eye. The patterns were faded, but the stitching was fine and delicate. Without even thinking about it, I found a small sewing kit in my pocket, something I always carried, and began mending the ragged edges. The familiar, repetitive motion of the needle and thread was soothing. I found myself humming softly as I worked. Later, while a simple stew I'd started was simmering on the stove, I took a closer look at the food supplies. The shelves held decent provisions: flour, beans, coffee, jars of preserved vegetables, and strips of dried meat. But I made a mental note of what was running low: salt, lamp oil, sugar. By late afternoon, the cabin felt different. It felt more like a home. The shelves were organized, the floor was swept clean, and the mended quilt lay folded neatly across the foot of the bed. Jonas came in, stamping the snow from his boots. He stopped just inside the door and looked around. He didn't say anything, but I saw a flicker of quiet approval in his eyes. Over supper, he finally broke the comfortable silence that had settled between us. Need to ride into town soon, running low on salt and lamp oil. I looked up from my bowl of stew. I could cook, I offered hesitantly, and clean, to earn my keep until the spring. I'm a good cook. Jonas considered this for a moment, stroking his beard. Then he nodded. Reckon that's fair. He sopped up the last of his stew with a piece of cornbread. You did good work today. The simple praise warmed me more than the fire. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, Jonas settled in his chair by the lamp. He pulled a crumpled, worn letter from his coat pocket and unfolded it carefully. As he read, his expression slowly darkened. His jaw tightened, and a hard, angry light came into his eyes. He didn't make a sound, but the air in the cabin suddenly felt heavy, charged with a new tension. Without a word, he folded the paper back up along its worn creases and tucked it inside a thick, leather-bound Bible that sat on a small shelf near the fireplace. Is something wrong? I asked, unable to stop myself. He stared into the fire for a long moment, his face a mask of stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hard, like rocks grinding together. Some men, he said, are after my land. He offered nothing more, but I could feel the weight of 1,000 unspoken words hanging in the air between us. The lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, and somewhere in the far distance, a lone coyote called to its mate. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders, a sudden chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I suddenly realized that the peaceful quiet of our snowbound sanctuary was fragile, and it might not last for long. The stove popped as a log settled, the sharp sound making me jump. Jonas remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the flames, as if he were reading dark tidings in their dance. I wanted to ask him more about the letter, about these men who wanted his land. But something in his rigid posture, in the hard set of his jaw, warned me against it. Instead, I picked up my mending again, letting the soft, repetitive scratch of the needle through the fabric fill the tense silence. Whatever trouble was coming, it was his trouble, and I was just a stranger he had saved on a whim. But as I sat there, stitching the old fabric back together, I couldn't shake the feeling that his trouble was about to become my own. 3 days of calm, clear weather followed the storm. The morning sun glinted off the pristine drifts of snow, making the whole world look clean and new. Jonas was outside, hitching his sturdy pack mule to a small wooden sled. He checked each leather strap with careful, methodical attention, tugging on them to make sure they were secure. I stood in the cabin doorway, wrapped in a spare wool coat he'd given me. It was too large, the sleeves too long, but its heavy weight felt solid and reassuring against the bitter morning cold. I watched as he loaded several empty supply sacks onto the sled and tied them down with rope. "Ready?" he asked, his breath making a big white cloud in the crisp air. I nodded, though my stomach was doing nervous little flips at the thought of going back to Cutter's Creek. Back to the stairs and the whispers. He helped me onto the sled, making sure I was settled and steady before he climbed up beside me. He made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, the mule's ears flicked back, and we started off down the snowpacked trail. The journey down the mountain took much longer than our first ride up in the dark. The sled runners creaked and groaned over the frozen ruts in the trail. Branches heavy with snow drooped low across our path, and Jonas had to keep brushing aside ice-laden pine boughs. As we got closer to Cutter's Creek, my anxiety grew with every turn in the road. The town looked different in the bright daylight. It looked smaller and somehow meaner. Smoke rose from the chimneys into the crystal-clear sky, and the sharp, rhythmic sound of a hammer on an anvil echoed from the blacksmith shop. Our arrival did not go unnoticed. Faces appeared in the frosted windows of the shops. People walking on the boardwalk stopped dead in their tracks to stare at us. I could feel their eyes on my back, and I could almost hear the whispers that followed us as we moved down the main street. "Ain't right," I heard someone mutter as we passed. Jonas's expression remained as neutral and unreadable as ever, but I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He guided the mule to a hitching post outside the general store and helped me down from the sled. The bell over the store's door jangled loudly as we entered, bringing with it a blast of warm air and the mingled smells of coffee, leather, and chewing tobacco. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. His gaze slid right past me, as if I were a ghost, and focused solely on Jonas. "McBride," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question, but a statement. "Peterson," Jonas replied, his voice just as even. "Salt, lamp oil, a few other things." He began gathering the supplies we needed while I stood near the pot-bellied stove, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. My fingers traced the rough wool of the borrowed coat as I watched him move through the store with his usual efficient purpose. "Any mail for me?" Jonas asked as he set his items on the counter. Mr. Peterson reached under the counter and produced a small stack of envelopes. "Came yesterday on the stage." He began tallying up Jonas's purchases, his lips moving silently. He still refused to even look in my direction. Jonas thumbed through the letters, his expression unchanging. Then he paused at one. It was a long, official-looking envelope with an unfamiliar wax seal on the back. He tucked it into his coat pocket without opening it. He paid for the supplies, and we started loading them into the sacks. I was grateful to have something to do with my hands, to have a reason not to look at the curious faces peering in through the store's front window. Outside in the weak winter sunlight, Jonas stopped. He pulled the mysterious letter from his pocket. He broke the seal with his thumb and unfolded the paper. I watched his face as his eyes moved quickly across the page. I saw his jaw tighten again, the muscles working beneath his thick beard. I saw a flicker of something dark and dangerous in his eyes. "What is it?" I asked softly. He folded the letter with deliberate, sharp creases. "Railroad company," he said, his voice low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of fury that scared me. "Colorado and Western. They're claiming my land." My eyes widened. "Can they do that?" "Not if I can prove my right to it." He glanced around the street at the watching eyes before he continued in an even lower voice. "There's a deed from 1859. It belonged to my wife's family, her Cherokee kin. It proves they were here first, that the land is ours by treaty. Without it, the railroad says they'll take everything come spring." "Your wife was Cherokee?" I asked. Suddenly, a lot of things started to make sense. His isolation, his deep mistrust of the town, his kindness to me, another outcast. Jonas gave a single sharp nod. A raw pain flickered across his features, so intense it was like a physical blow. "Sarah lost her 2 winters back." He stopped, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "The town, they wouldn't help when she took sick." My heart ached for him, for the raw, unfinished grief in his voice. "The deed," I said gently, trying to bring him back to the present problem. "Where is it?" "Town archives, most likely." Jonas's expression darkened even more. "Filed under a different name. Her family name. A name the town council is trying to erase. Sarah's people lived in this valley long before the Silver Strike brought the mines, before Cutter's Creek even existed. But now," he shook his head in disgust, "now they'd rather forget that part of their history." "Can't you just search the archives?" "Been trying. The council makes it difficult. They put a man in charge, a clerk who loses papers and demands fees they know I can't pay. Some of them are already in the railroad's pocket. And this man," he tapped the pocket where he'd put the letter, "Agent Coulter. He's the one behind this. He's got friends in high places. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." A sudden gust of wind swept down the street, carrying a fresh flurry of snowflakes with it. I pulled Jonas's coat tighter around me, watching the townspeople hurry past, their eyes averted, their faces closed. The weight of what he had just shared settled over me. It wasn't just the threat to his land. It was the deeper wounds that lay beneath it all. This was a man who had loved across boundaries, who had been punished for it, who had lost not just a wife, but justice itself. "We should head back," Jonas said, his voice gruff again. "Storm's coming." He glanced up at the dark clouds that were gathering over the high peaks of the mountains. As we left the town behind, my mind was working furiously. The deed was here, somewhere in this town, buried in dusty records. The key to saving Jonas's land, his home, his history, lay hidden in ink and paper, in names that powerful men wanted to be forgotten. I watched his profile as he guided the mule homeward. I could see the worry etched in the lines around his eyes and the grim set of his mouth. The railroad's threat hung over us like the approaching storm clouds, casting a long, dark shadow over the small sanctuary we had begun to build. But I had learned a long time ago that even the powerless, the forgotten, could find ways to fight back. And as the sled runners cut a clean line through the fresh snow, I began to form a plan. The next morning dawned clear and painfully cold. The frost on the cabin's small window panes was so thick it looked like delicate lace. Inside, Jonas was already up and moving, with a quiet, focused purpose. He was packing supplies into his worn leather saddlebags, a bedroll, a bag of oats for the horses. I was in the kitchen area, wrapping chunks of jerky and hardtack in clean cloth. My back ached from bending over, and the baby within me was stirring restlessly, as if it could sense the tension in the air. "Might take a few days," Jonas said, checking the straps on his pack for the third time. "The archives are a mess of papers. The town clerk, he keeps poor records on purpose, I reckon. Makes it easier to lose things." I nodded, tucking the wrapped food into a canvas bag. "We'll find it," I said, with more confidence than I actually felt. Jonas paused in his preparations and studied my face. "This trip won't be easy. The canyon roads are treacherous this time of year." "I can manage," I assured him, straightening my spine and trying to ignore the dull ache in my back. I had endured far worse than a cold ride. I wasn't about to let him leave me behind. We set out just as the sun was clearing the eastern ridge. Jonas had saddled both horses this time, his big bay for himself, and the gentler sorrel mare for me. The animals picked their way carefully down the snowpacked trail, their hooves crunching through patches of ice. The canyon walls rose up on either side of us, steep and imposing, their rocky faces dusted white with fresh snow. Long icicles hung like crystal daggers from the rocky outcrops. After an hour of careful, silent riding, I gathered my courage. There was something I had to know. "Will you tell me about her?" I asked, my voice small in the vast quiet canyon. "Your wife?" Jonas rode on for several long moments without answering. His shoulders were tense beneath his coat. Just when I thought he was going to ignore my question, his deep voice carried back to me on the cold air. "Sarah was—" He paused as if searching for words big enough. "She saw beauty everywhere, even in this harsh country." His gloved hand made a small gesture to the wilderness around us. "She taught me the Cherokee names for all the plants, showed me how to read the weather in the clouds." "She had a laugh," he said, his voice growing softer. "That could warm the coldest night." The raw pain in his voice was a tangible thing. It made my own heart ache in sympathy. How did she fall ill?" His words came harder now, strained. "A fever. It took hold fast. Started in her chest. I went to town for medicine. The doctor was there. He had what she needed. But the council—" His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jump. "They said they couldn't spare supplies for her kind." He stopped talking. I could hear the ragged sound of his breathing. By the time I rode to the next town over and found another doctor, it was too late. Tears welled up in my eyes, hot against my cold cheeks. I blinked them away quickly. "That's why you helped me," I said softly. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. A sharp, jerky movement. "Couldn't stand by," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not again." We rode in silence after that, the weight of his story settling between us. By mid-morning we reached Cutter's Creek. The courthouse loomed at the end of the main street, a stern gray building that looked like it had been built without a single smile. Inside, a sour-faced clerk sat behind a high wooden rail. He looked up from his paperwork with obvious displeasure as we entered, bringing a gust of cold air with us. "We need to search the land deed records," Jonas stated firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "From 1859. The clerk's thin lips twisted into a smirk. "Those archives are restricted. Access requires an expedited search fee." "How much?" Jonas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be ridiculous. $50, the clerk said, and his smirk widened into a triumphant smile. "Cash only." I gasped. It was an impossible sum. It was more than 3 months' wages for most working men in this town. It was a wall built of money designed to keep people like Jonas out. Jonas's hand tightened on the brim of his hat. I could see the fury building in his eyes. But before he could say or do anything we would all regret, a gentle voice spoke from behind us. "Good morning, friends." We turned. Reverend Amos Whitaker was standing in the doorway, his kind, wrinkled face creased with a welcoming smile. The elderly preacher nodded to the clerk, who had the grace to look slightly ashamed of himself. "Jonas McBride," the Reverend said warmly, his eyes twinkling. "It has been too long, and this must be Miss Carter." "Sir," I replied, touched that he had called me Miss instead of just using my first name like everyone else. "Would you both do me the honor of joining me for a cup of coffee?" the Reverend asked. "My Martha just took a fresh loaf of bread from the oven this morning." The parsonage was a modest, cozy home right next to the white-painted church. It was filled with books and smelled wonderfully of baking bread and wood smoke. In the snug little kitchen, Reverend Amos poured steaming coffee into 3 mugs, while Jonas quickly explained our search for the deed. "Ah, yes," the Reverend said thoughtfully, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I remember Sarah's family well. Good people. They helped build the very first church here, long before the town was properly settled." He took a sip of his coffee. We kept our own records back then. The church did. Marriages, land transfers, births, deaths. Before the courthouse was built, the church was the center of community life." A tiny flicker of hope ignited in my chest. You, you still have those records? Indeed I do, the Reverend smiled. They're in the church basement, and in fact, now that you mention it, I believe I do recall something about that particular deed. It was a special arrangement to protect the land. He set his cup down. Let me look through the old church books. Come back in 2 days. I should have an answer for you by then. Jonas put his own cup down on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. Much obliged, Reverend. But why? Why are you helping us? The old man's kind eyes grew serious. Because, Jonas, I stood silent once before, when Sarah needed help. God forgive me. I let my fear of the council's reaction keep me from doing what was right. I will not make that same mistake a second time. We left the parsonage with our hearts feeling lighter than they had in days. But as we rode back up the canyon, the wind began to pick up again, driving loose snow across the trail in ghostly white snakes. Cutter's Creek was a town of secrets and lies, run by men who would rather erase history than honor it. We had found an ally, but I had a cold, sinking feeling that the men who wanted Jonas's land wouldn't give up that easily, and 2 days was a very long time.